Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. Um, Wanted to talk today about a headline that kind of shouldn't be a headline, and that is that the Israel Defense Forces have publicly and a bit more loudly than in the past confirmed that the statistics, the mortality statistics that have been published by the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza are in fact accurate. Um, the idea that this was ever in doubt is ridiculous, and is the result of an intentional public relations and media campaign to obscure reality, and that began literally from October 8th, 2023. Um, Anyone who is familiar with the Ministry of Health in Gaza and how it works did not doubt the figures that were coming out from the very beginning. And that, by the way, included Israeli intelligence. And that hit the news several times over the course of the genocide, that Israeli intelligence knew and agreed that the Gaza Ministry of Health was an accurate source. And so what both the United States and Israel kept doing and kept repeating to reporters whenever they referred to these statistics, they kept calling it the Hamas run Ministry of Health. Well, Hamas ran the entire government, but everyone understood that the Ministry of Health was committed to facts. That had been the case for many years. Their figures had been reliable and had been used. In fact, in previous Israeli attacks, those figures had been used by the Israelis themselves to determine who had been killed, how many, etc. They knew they were reliable. The reason, of course, that they were saying that these, they kept repeating that these are Hamas run ministry, as if to say that Hamas was clearly to give people the impression that Hamas was manipulating the figures, which was never true. Uh, just listen to the words of Nir Hassan, reporter in Haaretz today. He said, and I'm quoting here: Israel's eventual acceptance of the Gaza Health Ministry's reported death toll should come as no surprise. Though Israeli officials heavily scrutinized the figures at the war's start, no prominent Israeli spokesman has disputed them for several months. So that all faded into the background. The debate on the ministry's credibility exists almost solely on social media and in Israeli mainstream media. Every single government, nonprofit organization, and scholar who deals with Gaza accepts the ministry's data and considers it very reliable. Speaking as somebody who is a longtime employee of nonprofit organizations and a longtime scholar who has dealt with Gaza, that is very true. It's not just me by any means. Uh, Everybody, people I agree with, people I disagree with, anybody who's anyone in this field who knows what the hell they're talking about knows that these figures were reliable. They've known it all along. It's not a secret. But those figures were almost immediately undermined. And the primary person who undermined them it was not Benjamin Netanyahu, it was not Itamar Ben-Gvir, it was not Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL, or anyone else that you might suspect of being part of the Israel PR machine. Now, the person who really undermined the credibility of these numbers was none other than former President Joe Biden. Among the many, many ways in which Joe Biden is not just complicit, but a full partner in the genocide in Gaza. This was one of the most devastating because almost immediately, this was in October of 2023, so almost immediately, it's about 2 weeks into the war. The Gaza Health Ministry had released a list that documented the deaths of more than 7,000 Palestinians, including almost 3,000 children. This was just 2 weeks into Israel's genocide. Biden with no evidence, no basis for saying this other than his own racism, which is enormous, said, and I quote, that he had no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using. I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. And that was Joe Biden. And that set the tone, of course, for Biden's behavior for the rest of the genocide. I want to go. I want to go back for a second to Nir Hassan because he writes, to understand why the health ministry's reports are reliable, we must first ask which contradictory information exists. But there are no, and this is still Hassan. This is not me. This is still Nir Hassan. But there are no contradictory reports. The most recent war in Gaza, which began on October 7th, 2023, is the first war in Israeli history in which the IDF did not publish any official data on casualties from the opposing side. And we know for an absolute fact that Israel was as capable, if not more so, in this during this onslaught than they had been in the past of tracking who among Palestinians they had killed. So this was an intentional omission. There has been, I mean, we know that there's tracking software that's been employed. We know that there's all sorts of technology that Israel has deployed to track down specific people and to follow the course of their own attacks and to see, what happened now, and one of the sources would also be the Ministry of Health itself. But Israel did none of that. They intentionally did not look at these numbers. So they could just throw out whatever they want. And there's no, within Israel, there's no way to contradict them because you've already thrown all this shade on the Palestinian figures. And there's without the military doing any sort of tracking of their own numbers and intentionally omitting that action, there's nothing for even well-meaning Israeli and international journalists to find to support the accusation or to support the figures that the Ministry of Health was putting out, or to even deal with, the Israeli side of the story. Israel didn't have a side of the story. They simply said the Palestinians are lying and left it at that. The Ministry of Health, in fact, throughout the genocide, did an unbelievable job. And there were times, and believe me, it wasn't missed. When there were times that, under the unbelievably difficult conditions that they were trying to work, that some of their figures were not as strongly substantiated as they would have liked them to have been. They simply couldn't come up with fully accurate figures. And so few things resulted from that. There were mistakes, which were later corrected. Again, acknowledged by everyone who was paying attention, including people who have quite a bit of animus, certainly to Hamas and to Palestinians in general. Again, NGOs and governments around the world. So there were some of the problems, and there was a severe undercount. There are definitely people who were missed. They got most of their information from morgues. So to the extent that people who were killed were brought to morgues and could be identified, there is a number of people on the that still are in the ministry's figures that they have dead bodies that they can't identify. So I mean, this has been among many things that are just the story of reality being turned on its head throughout this genocide. This is one of the most obscene. And it's one of the ways that, frankly, Americans, Jewish and otherwise, and Israelis and Europeans, Emiratis, some others, can convince themselves that the genocide did not happen, when of course it did. It's quite obvious. Um, Few genocides have ever been so well documented in real time and have so clearly met the definition under international law of genocide as this one. But how do you create a narrative where so many millions of people believe that's not true? This is one of the ways. You say, well, really, not that many people didn't die. And now that they have admitted it, what they have, what they're still arguing is that, well, the ministry doesn't differentiate between combatants and civilians, which is true. The ministry is listing the people. Now, they don't differentiate between who is a combatant and who is a civilian, but they are identifying them. And they're identifying them thoroughly. Names, where they're from, and identification numbers, which means that Israel can check on each and every name on that list, as can, Palestinian authorities. So there's no mystery here. There are obviously questions about the circumstances of deaths and things like that. You can't just identify somebody and then know that they're a combatant. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But Israel is now shifting from arguing that the numbers are false to promoting more, which this is, of course, an argument that's been going on from day one, but more loudly promoting the idea that it wasn't so many civilians as the Palestinians are saying, which is also nonsense. It's simply not true. Again, quoting from Hassan. He says that Netanyahu has claimed that the ratio between combatants and civilians is 1-to-1 or 1-to-1.5. On the other hand, the UK-based nonprofit organization Action on Armed Violence published a contradictory study this week, according to which for every combatant killed by Israeli fire, 5 civilians were killed, meaning 83% of all casualties were civilians. Now, you're going to say, well, it's a he said, she said, right? Well, it's not so he said, she said, because last August in 972 magazine, the Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham managed to get the figures from the IDF's own database of who was killed. So, they in fact, they were not publishing any of these figures. They were not making them public, but they were keeping some kind of record of who they knew they had killed. And according to their own numbers, Abraham reported, at least 83% of the people, this again, according to the IDF, 83% of the people who were killed in Gaza were civilians. And it's worse than that, because that was a minimal figure. It was at least 83%. But let's even say, okay, it was only 83%. But Israel has a very broad definition of who are combatants and therefore legitimate targets. In Israel's mind, in Israel's definition, anyone who has any connection at all to Hamas is a legitimate target and is an enemy combatant. Well, Hamas was the government of Gaza. So a whole lot of people work for Hamas in some capacity. This plays out in a number of ways. Recently, I noted in an article I wrote that one think tank in Israel tried to undermine the claim of how many journalists Israel has killed, which is far more than in any other war. I mean, it dwarfs Ukraine, it dwarfs any war you want to talk about. And it was obvious that it wasn't just that Israel was not. It wasn't just that Israel was indifferent to harm to journalists; they were targeting them. Again, it's one of the other ways you cover up a genocide and convince people it didn't happen is you don't let people report it by killing the journalists. But the way that this particular Israeli NGO decided to undermine the claim was to say, well, they worked for this Hamas television station. And yes, Hamas did have TV and radio, as the Israeli government does, as many governments do, by the way. The Hamas exercised a good deal of control over media, and if you were a journalist and you were trying to get a job, that's what it's where you were going to end up probably having to work, whatever your personal ideology was. Um, but that NGO considered those people combatants. Anyone who was perhaps a record keeper for the Qassam brigades, or any other Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These are factions that also have political wings. Those people are also considered targets by Israel. In fact, sometimes they're specifically targeted by Israel. So Israel has a very broad definition when they're classifying for themselves who the combatants are. They have a very broad definition of what that means. Again, this 83% figure, so we're already talking more than 4-1. 83% civilian is a very, very high figure, even for warfare. And it is probably an underestimate. So why has Israel now decided to more loudly say, okay, yes, we admit it. The Gaza Ministry of Health is correct in the numbers that they're putting out? Well, they're doing it because they know that as the so-called phase 2 moves forward, if it does, it's going to come out more and more just how many people have died in Gaza. We're already seeing it. We just recently saw an appalling figure of literally thousands of entire bloodlines completely wiped out in this genocide. The kind of horror story you hear from the worst genocides in history, in Rwanda, in the Holocaust, the worst genocides in history. The sort of things where you hear hundreds, thousands of family lines just wiped out. Hundreds more people where there's only one surviving member of an extended family. That's what genocide looks like. And they know this is going to come out. And they know that even the Ministry of Health figures are an underestimate. So they're accepting those so that they can now accuse anyone who comes up with higher figures of exaggerating, trying to make Israel look bad, and et cetera, and all the usual pro-Israel nonsense. What's also going to come out is how many people have died from exposure, from curable disease, the sort of what people call collateral damage of war, as if a dead person cares whether it was a bullet or the cold that killed them. When you look at the list that the Ministry of Health has put out, according to Nir Hassan, he said you find 17 babies who died, and this is died by direct violence by Israel. In other words, they were shot, they were blown up, something like that. 17 babies who died on the day they were born, 115 who died within a month of their birth, and 1,054 who died before they turned 1 year old. And again, how many more died because there was no formula and their mothers were suffering from malnutrition and could not breastfeed them? How many more have died from the elements? How many more died from diseases that could have been cured if Israel hadn't destroyed every hospital in Gaza or crippled, left them crippled and therefore overwhelmed? What's going to come out is worse. I mean, as much as people in Gaza did an incredible job of finding ways to get the information out, despite the fact that to this day, Israel does not allow international journalists into Gaza. Despite that, the people of Gaza were able to get some information out, but it's only some information. And you still have to sift through it because, of course, there'll always be some misinformation whenever it's, random people doing it. Sometimes people don't realize they're spreading misinformation. Often that happens. Um, they see something, they assume it's this or that, and they mistakenly broadcast that. You can imagine. But there's also a limit to what people can do with a cell phone. I mean, you don't have professional journalists there to really dig into something and to find out what's behind certain things and, the full story about this or that. And yet the word got out because the people in Gaza refused to be silenced. They refused to just shut up and die, um, much as Israel wanted them to. So this is why Israel's doing this now. They're trying to get out in front of the story, basically. And it's a good time to do it, given the fact that people are not paying that much attention to Gaza, and that's a problem. It's hard. I know, friends. I know. We in the United States are dealing with a fascist takeover in our own country. Yeah, it's hard to still pay attention to Gaza. We're looking at our country, perhaps as I'm speaking now, for all I know, the United States may have already started a military action against Iran, on the back of the military action against Venezuela and so many other things that this criminal administration is doing. And the situation in Gaza is not as attention grabbing as it was before this past October. So I get it and I understand why, but we have to find a way to still pay attention. We have to find a way to still look because it's going to get worse. I have an article out today. I will put a link to it in the description. Uh, uh, that talks about basically phase 2 of Trump's plan is essentially beginning a U.S. occupation of Gaza. Um, there's a lot going on, and we can't just not pay attention to it. As much as we're overwhelmed, I know we are. I get it, and I get that not everybody has time in their lives to do something about everything. And that's one of the things that the Trump administration counts on is that we're all just overwhelmed. But we have to do the best we can. And one of the ways we do the best we can is to try and get accurate information and share it with our neighbors. And the fact that Israel has admitted that that the figures of the Gaza Ministry of Health are accurate. Again, as Nir Hassan asked the question, um, what else has Israel been lying about? And they've been lying about plenty, as we've all been saying. Again, it's no consolation now that those of us, people like myself, and the many, many others who've been saying from the beginning, this is what's happening. This is the scale of the death. This is the scale of the civilians being slaughtered. It's not a consolation to say we were right. Believe me, I'd rather have been wrong about what happened in Gaza. I'd rather have found out that no, only 10,000 people. I'd much rather have found that out. Much rather. It's not the case. There was a genocide. It happened. It's still going on in a different form. And we need to continue paying attention to it. I will leave it there. If you found this useful, please share it. And if you can, like, subscribe. And if you can do anything to support the work of Cutting Through, we only get by on your support. So if you can do something to help, please do. And I will be talking to you soon.